Well, thank you, Sterling. Good morning. Thanks to the Heartland Institute for another great conference. And it's quite an honor for me to present to the scientists, economists, and friends today. And I'm going to go first, but I'm going to talk about the nuts and bolts of regulations and laws and about toppling the regulatory pillars of sustainable development. Four main pillars to be toppled. The first are the regulations on greenhouse gas emissions. Second, vehicle mandates and subsidies. Third, renewable energy mandates and subsidies at the federal and state level. And fourth, rolling back the bans on hydrocarbons. I don't know if you heard Mick Mulvaney last week, the new director of Office of Management and Budget. Very refreshing. He said, regarding the question as to climate change, we're not spending money on that anymore. And the new budget calls for slashing $2.5 billion from the EPA and climate cuts from the Energy Department, Department of State, NASA, NOAA. And we'll see if the Republicans will carry these through, but I'm optimistic. The heart of the matter is the 2009 endangerment finding by the EPA that Dr. Michaels discussed yesterday. The EPA found that greenhouse gas pollution threatens public health and welfare. And this is the basis for all of our major climate regulations, regulations on power plant emissions, the Clean Power Plan, corporate average fuel economy standards for vehicles, social cost of carbon, and other things. And this endangerment finding is going to be used as a basis in legal attacks for anything that the EPA tries to roll back. So it's important that we roll this back. But this is not going to be easy. Prior to the endangerment finding, the Supreme Court in the case Massachusetts versus EPA, and this was a case brought by Massachusetts and 10 other states, sued the EPA, saying they should be regulating greenhouse gases under the Clean Air Act. And the majority opinion of the U.S. Supreme Court said, under the clear terms of the Clean Air Act, EPA can avoid taking further action only if it determines that greenhouse gases do not contribute to climate change, or if it provides some reasonable explanations as to why it cannot or will not exercise its discretion to determine whether they do. And new Administrator Pruitt, in his written testimony before Congress in January, said the Administrator has an important role when it comes to the regulation of carbon dioxide, which I will fulfill consistent with Massachusetts versus EPA and the agency's endangerment finding on greenhouse gases, respective of the applicable statutory framework established by Congress. Now, what I think we hope is that President Trump orders Mr. Pruitt to rescind the endangerment finding. But again, as I said, this is not going to be easy. One path is for the EPA to directly try and rescind this. That's going to go through a little bit of a legal minefield. It's going to face probably a new public comment period. There's going to be a multi-year battle. The states and the non-governmental organizations are going to bring legal suits trying to block this rescindment. And it does risk defeat where the court may decide this is either arbitrary or against scientific opinion. Maybe some of the new evidence that Dr. Michaels talked about yesterday could be of help in winning along that path. Now, Chris Horner of CEI, who I respect very well and who is an insider, thinks that the EPA does have precedent and some statutory ability to make the decision and get it through, so we'll see. A more direct path may be to clarify the Clean Air Act itself through action by Congress and to indicate that the Clean Air Act was never meant to apply to greenhouse gas emissions and should not apply. That, of course, would remove the basis for all of the greenhouse gas laws, but that will likely face a filibuster in the Senate, so it'll be very difficult. The second area that we need to roll back is vehicle subsidies, particularly the corporate average fuel economy standards set up by the EPA and the Department of Transportation, which calls for automobile mileage standards of 54.5 miles per gallon by 2025. The press talks about mileage, but these standards are all written about carbon dioxide emissions. That's the substance of all of these. And then at the end of the last year, the EPA rushed through their decision on heavy vehicle standards, CAFE standards, saying that their new regulation would reduce emissions by over 1 million CO2 emissions per year. But this will add an estimated $15,000 to the cost of a new heavy truck. Now, the good news on this last regulation is it may be able to be rolled back by Congress under the Congressional Review Act. I think they have about until May to do that. But there's a further problem here, and that is even if these CAFE standards are rolled back, the states may then take the lead on determining what truck and car manufacturers produce. The state of California was given an exemption under the Clean Air Act to set its own carbon standards, and if the state of California and the state of New York and the state of Massachusetts, Oregon, Washington, number of others join together, those may set the tune for emissions from vehicles. Electric cars were created by sustainable development ideology, the whole concept of going to electric cars. Back in 2011, President Obama said we can break our dependence on oil and become the first country to have 1 million electric vehicles on the road by 2015. Well, of course, that hasn't happened, but we still have subsidies in place from the Clean Energy and Security Act of 2009, up to $7,500 tax credit for purchase of a plug-in electric, over $5 billion in grants and loan guarantees for electrics and for battery technology development, and the last administration had the EV Everywhere Challenge and the Workplace Charging Challenge. And Europe is doing much of the same thing. Germany, Netherlands, Norway are all looking to ban the internal combustion engine, force all cars to be electrics by the year 2030. But most Americans don't want plug-in electric cars. A little graph here of U.S. small vehicle sales, almost 18 million last year. That little tiny line at the bottom there, that's plug-in hybrid electric vehicles. The Ford F-Series pickup truck was the leading selling model in the U.S. last year, and it sold 5 times the amount of plug-in electrics. And the amount of vehicles, 63% of vehicles were SUVs or pickup trucks in the U.S. market last year, up from 50% just 3 years ago. So Americans don't want little tiny plug-in electric cars, they want the bigger stuff. The third area is rolling back the green energy subsidy regime. The main areas here are the wind production tax credit, solar net metering at a state level, and the state renewable portfolio standards laws. I hope you all know why wind energy is such a big hit in Iowa. Iowa now has the highest density of wind turbines in the country. And the reason is because, first, wind systems erected in Iowa get a almost 2.3 cents wind production tax credit, 2.3 cents per kilowatt hour. That's reducing slowly over time. But the state of Iowa also paid an additional 1.5 cents per kilowatt hour, a total of almost 4 cents per kilowatt hour in an after-tax credit. And the market price for electricity, wholesale price, was only 3.5 cents a kilowatt hour in Iowa. So, man, everybody ought to be building wind turbines in Iowa. Interesting, though, if we look at electricity prices in the states that are erecting wind turbines over the last 8 years, from 2008 to 2016, first thing we should note is that U.S. electricity prices have risen very little. That's that blue line, 4.8% in the last 8 years. But 9 of the top 12 wind states have increases of 13 to 37% over that time period. So we see one of the results of subsidies for wind, and that is higher electricity prices. Massachusetts is paying enormous subsidies for solar. Governor Deval Patrick said, "We have a solar revolution underway here in the Commonwealth. Solar is a key part of our clean energy future." Well, that's because they were paying solar developers 30 cents a kilowatt hour when the market price was $5. Well, every Tom, Jane, and Harry should have been building solar in Massachusetts, and they would have been, except they restricted the number of these subsidy situations that they handed out. Anyone, interesting question here. Does solar provide a net energy gain? A study last year by Ferroni and Hopkirk, they did an analysis called Energy Recovered over Energy Invested for solar systems that were installed in Germany and in Switzerland. And they found that over the 25-year life of a solar system, they didn't receive as much energy out as it took to create the solar cells and install the systems. Only 82% of the energy was recovered. Now, I've translated this to the United States by adjusting the insulation, and it turns out that anything built above the 35th degree latitude is not going to get as much energy out. So anybody putting in solar in Massachusetts is paying for a lot of energy to be used in China, and they don't get as much out when they put it into Massachusetts. Net metering is another thing that needs to be rolled back. We need to change net metering credits to the wholesale price. Today, most states that have net metering pay a credit that's equal to the retail price, somewhere between 8 and 20 cents per kilowatt hour. But the actual value of that generated electricity is 3 to 5 cents a kilowatt hour. So we ought to roll those back. State of Nevada did that in 2015. And solar installations dropped 90% in a single year. Roger Helmer gave a great presentation on some of the madness in Europe yesterday. This is a little bit of a quantification. What I've plotted on the vertical axis is the per person wind and solar capacity in a nation. Along the horizontal axis is the retail electricity price for all the nations of Europe. And if you look, you see a pretty good trend there. The more wind and solar you have, the higher your electricity prices. In Spain, they're paying 3 times the United States price, and in Germany and Denmark, 4 times the United States price. Another demonstrated result of wind and solar subsidies, again, higher electricity rates. And in more than 25 states, we have renewable portfolio standards laws, marvelous laws which force our utilities to buy an increasing amount of wind and solar and renewable generation or be fined. Consumers pay twice for these, first through their taxes and the subsidies that go to the wind and solar companies, and second, they pay with higher electricity rates. We need to roll these back. Some of that is occurring already. In Kansas, Ohio, North Carolina, West Virginia, these states have rolled back or weakened their renewable portfolio standards laws. And the fourth area is bans on hydrocarbon use. Ladies and gentlemen, we live in the age of nope. It used to be NIMBY, not in my backyard, but today it's nope, not on planet Earth. If there's a pipeline, if there's a power plant, if there's an export terminal, if there's even a university endowment that involves hydrocarbons, it's going to be opposed. Well, for 30 years I had the joy of kayaking the great whitewater rivers of North America, so this image caught my attention. This is a picture of Seattle Harbor in 2015. That tall structure you see in the back, the yellow structure, that's a Shell oil drilling terminal on its way to the Arctic Ocean. Now, all these protesters in kayaks in front, they're all wearing a Gore-Tex dry suit or some other synthetic material. They have a personal flotation device of nylon and foam. They have a neoprene spray skirt. They have a boat made of cross-linked polyethylene, or carbon fiber composite. Even their paddles and signs are plastic, folks. Everything they're wearing comes from a hydrocarbon. So we need to roll back these hydrocarbon bans, and the new administration has already started down that path. Bans on the Keystone XL pipeline and Dakota Access pipeline are lifted. We have bans on coal mining, eastern U.S. offshore drilling, Arctic drilling that need to be lifted, and at the state level, the bans on hydraulic fracturing in New York State, Vermont, and most recently in Maryland. One thing you should get from this conference, if you attended the scientific panel, is that the evidence is showing that climate change is dominated by natural rather than man-made factors. There is no regulation that the EPA can put in place that will stop the oceans from rising. There's no law that any state can pass that will make the storms less frequent or less severe. Because climate change is dominated by natural factors, thousands of laws across hundreds of nations, all summed together, are not going to have a meaningful impact on global temperatures. But there is one demonstrated result from wind and solar subsidies, and if there are any representatives from states or our federal government listening today, the question your constituents ought to be asking you is, why do you want to raise our energy prices? So in summary, we need to topple the Sustainable Development Regulations. That is to roll back the endangerment finding on carbon dioxide, or go through congressional action to do that, remove corporate average fuel economy standards for vehicles, eliminate the subsidies for electric plug-in cars, phase out wind and solar subsidies at federal and state levels, rescind the state RPS laws, and roll back the hydrocarbon bans. I look forward to your questions.